he said, "It's not what's said that matters, it's what's heard." He was from Mobile, Alabama. So, and so in the book, that's translated to, "It's not what you say, it's what they hear." We spend so much time worrying about as leaders or just humans, right? Like as we're talking, I know what I'm thinking and I'm just going to spit it out there. I need to consider how you will receive it, what you will hear, because my goal is to have what you hear be what I'm thinking. And there's so many things that interrupt that. And so taking the time to think about that carefully, you got to know the person you're talking to well enough to understand how they will receive it.
I am really excited to chat with you today, Tom, and get to know you a little bit better. You have a wonderful, rich background as a leader in science, and I know that there's a lot of unique insight we can gather from you today. I actually haven't interviewed anyone with your type of background before. I'm interested in getting to know you a little bit. Do you mind sharing your background and your journey through leadership for us?
Sure. First, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to our conversation. I think it's going to be fun. My background, what I do day in and day out is I'm a pediatric cardiologist. So I take care of children and adults who were born with abnormal hearts and arteries. So that's what I do in my day job, quote unquote. But several years ago, I started really getting interested in leadership as a practice, as a way of bearing, if you will, and started studying that pretty aggressively with regard to my own personal reading. Ended up doing a master's degree in leadership during that time. I got some ideas for some studies that I would like to do in leadership and started conducting those during the master's and I got an idea for the book that I wanted to read. I was in the military in the past, and so the book I wanted to read was The Wisdom of Four-Star Generals, the leadership wisdom of four-star generals. It'd be so cool to have that book with their perspectives and their stories but do it in a scientific way. And I ended up started working on that in 2022 and interviewed 51 retired four-star generals and admirals, and then synthesized it, analyzed, codified all these sorts of things, and came up with a new leadership framework that is the heart of a book that will be coming out in July called The Four Stars of Leadership.
That's very exciting. I'm excited to read that when it's published. What are some of the biggest takeaways that you got from those interviews? You might not maybe have all of them or want to share all of them just yet before the book comes out, but could you give us a teaser or a little taste?
Sure, yeah. So as the name implies, there are four pillars, if you will, of great leadership, and they all start with C: character, competence, caring, and communication. And those are all derived from these four-star generals and admirals. And so basically the book kind of walks through those. One section is, character, one section's competence, caring, communication, and each section has about 3 chapters in it. Kind of go through those. And there are so many. I mean, originally when I wrote the book, it was 500 pages, and so I had to cut it in half basically. And so this first book is, just that is the first book because there was so much material. So anyway, those four, and in those, I mean, for instance, lead from the front, right? A leader, people probably have seen this these sorts of memes where there's like a leader there's a big block of stone, right? And they got three people and they're pulling this thing, and there's the boss who's on top and saying, go that way. And then the leader version is they're at the front of the rope pulling too. So this idea of lead from the front, that we need to be experiencing the same sort of discomfort and danger is what General Marty Dempsey described it as those people that we're leading. So that's a very small, kind of pocket size information on some of these sorts of ideas.
Love that. I can't wait to read all those stories too. 500 pages is a lot, and it makes me think, well, they say that writing is more so editing, but how hard it must be to distill all of that greatness down to 50%. So, where do you even begin with that? Do you have plans for a part two, or a spin-off on a different topic?
Yeah, so definitely, basically, I wrote it, got a what's called developmental editor, and she helped me to identify what parts we were going to set aside to come back for a second book later, so that everything still flows well and is integrated well. So yeah, definitely another. I mean, it's practically written. The second book is practically written, but then there's more material even than that. So I think there are going to be probably 3, 4 books that will come from this work.
That'd be great. And I'm curious, with the 4 pillars, you were mentioning them and giving us a really great summary of what those mean. I'm curious if you find there's one that leaders today struggle with the most, or is it a sort of even balance that we all kind of have to work on them equally?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, Rebecca. And I think that it depends on the person. Everybody's got strengths and everybody's got challenges. Certainly, we can all imagine somebody who is really a, a nice person, cares about people. Maybe they can communicate that well. Maybe they're an upstanding person of virtue, but they're incompetent, right? Or you can mix it up in any set of ways, right? And so then this is part of a few future work, but they create these archetypes. So the example that I use to make it easy for people to understand is the grandmother. And so when it comes to your grandmother, you want her to love you, right? So she cares about you. You want her to be able to convey that to you. That's communication. You want to be able to trust her, right? So that's the virtuous stuff. So that's character. You don't really care if she's competent, right? Like you're not worried about her ability to program a computer or whatever it may be, right? Or lead a group of people or like that doesn't matter, right? So that's the grandmother archetype. So you see, everybody's got different mixtures. Some people can't communicate at all. Some people don't care.
Yeah.
Some people may have two. Some people may have one. So yeah, it really varies.
Yeah, and it could be that blend, like you're saying, where maybe we have to work on a couple of those, or
Yeah.
maybe one is our Achilles heel that we really need to focus on. I've never heard of the grandmother, but now I'm like extra interested in your book because I want to hear all of them. That's going to be really exciting to get to read and dive into that. I'm curious, did you, in all of those interviews, did you figure out or find sort of like an epiphany moment for yourself where you feel like you cracked into a philosophy or a new approach to leadership that you hadn't thought of before?
I think so when you have the opportunity to, like, nobody's ever done this. This is like this project that's never been done. And so to have the opportunity to spend that time and get this download with each of these people who average 36 years of military leadership training and experience, 140,000 people on average that they led, budgets north of $12 billion a year. So huge responsibility. And they're taking this time to talk to some clown like me, right? And so each one was a master class in leadership. And so I just remember coming away from so many of them overwhelmed with like, wow, I got a lot to think about here. And so then I went through that process. And then there was the process of the mechanics of doing the work, of analyzing what they said, making sure that my transcript was in line with what they actually said and what we recorded. And then taking that and analyzing it for all the different things that are in there and then seeing what bubbled to the top. And that's where these 4 C's came from. And that's this framework of thinking about leadership. So the idea of kind of epiphany, not so much because it was so much in the weeds of the science of making sure that I was doing this well and that sort of thing. But there are tons of ideas in there that are just, man, if people could just get this one thing right, right? And there are lots of things, okay? There are probably 50 big ideas in this book, okay? But just one, like, wow, you could be so much better of a leader if you could just nail that thing, right? And for instance, one that I shared that was probably the most that just has revolutionized the way I go about what I do came from a number of people. The one who articulated it closest to what it actually is in the book was Admiral Snuffy Smith. And he said, it's not what's said that matters, it's what's heard. He was from Mobile, Alabama, so, and so in the book, that's translated to, it's not what you say, it's what they hear.
Mhm.
We spend so much time worrying about as leaders or just humans, right? Like, as we're talking, I know what I'm thinking, and I'm just gonna spit it out there. I need to consider how you will receive it, what you will hear, because my goal is to have what you hear be what I'm thinking.
Mhm.
And there's so many things that interrupt that. And so taking the time to think about that carefully, you got to know the person you're talking to well enough to understand how they will receive it. So there's a lot that goes into that. Kind of spell that out in the chapter 12 of the book, the communication process. Anyway, those sorts of things. That is one that I really found to be kind of eye opening to me. It may not be for a lot of people, but that really was. And it's concise and portable.
Mhm. I love that. I'm glad you shared that because the idea of communication, how communication is received, comes up a lot with guests on this podcast. And I love the emphasis on it because, Tom, I feel like it speaks to the self awareness that we need to have as leaders and the awareness for our team members too, and how they respond and how they absorb information. So I'm glad you highlight that. You also said something about how the interviews were a masterclass for you, and that's very much how I feel about this podcast. I always come away inspired, motivated with new tools in my toolkit. I hope the audience does too. I've gotten some really great feedback, but that's the goal of this podcast is to help people come away with that inspiration and that information. And so I don't want to assume, but I imagine your podcast is similar for you too, in that you're creating this masterclass of information. Tell us about the science of leadership and let's dive into a little bit of that. I'm curious what the thesis or some of the themes to your podcast and the work that you're doing on the science side, how they play into leadership.
Yeah, so the science of leadership, as I was going through this and was finishing up the draft of the book, some folks were like, "You got to do a podcast," and I was like, "I need one more thing on my plate to do." But then I started thinking about it, and I was like, "Yeah, that'd probably be a good idea." And oh, by the way, I have access to more four-star generals and admirals than anybody just about. So they'd make a good group along with a bunch of other people. And so, but as a scientist, because I'm an academic pediatric cardiologist and I'm a vice chair of a department and all this sort of stuff. And I do a lot of research, in congenital heart disease and things. And so I come at it from a scientific mindset. And so as I thought about all the books that I've read 340 leadership books. And all the books that I've read, they take a similar sort of approach to talking about leadership. It's one person, talking about what they did in their hot dog stand or whatever it was, or a book that may have three or four stories about people: Steve Jobs, Howard Schultz from Starbucks, Herb Keller from Southwest Airlines. Like it's the same stuff over and over and over, right? In these books. And rarely do they talk about any science behind it. Like what's the evidence other than this one person did this thing, right? And so as I thought about what I would want in a podcast, it would be something that was grounded in that brought together an important leadership topic, but did it with story because humans are made for story. We're not made for data, but did it with story from somebody who really is accomplished as a leader and then brought in the science that shows why this particular topic is really important. So, for instance, take one of the first folks that I had on our podcast was General Vince Brooks, phenomenal person. He's who I want to be when I grow up. And so he talked about servant leadership, right? And so, okay, well, what is that? We define it, what it is, why it's important, and then how do you do it? What are the practical steps? That's kind of the approach to the podcast. And in that why is it important portion, we always talk about here's the science. Here's this study that shows this and that study that shows the other. And that's why it's evidence that if you incorporate this, whether it's, you know, great feedback or how to persuade people or whatever it may be, then you can be a better, more effective leader. And again, then we give you it may be 3, it may be 10 at the most, but practical things that people can do to actually deploy those capabilities in their leadership. So that's kind of the approach with the science of leadership. As far as I can tell, there's nothing else out there on the market like that. We've been gaining a lot of traction and getting a lot of folks listening and stuff. So it seems to be going well.
That's great. Well, I'm excited to give that a listen too. And it makes me curious in that regard. Have you come across any data that's been surprising to you where maybe we have as a society or just as leaders some sort of preconceived notion that something is true about leadership and that the data is actually saying no, hold on, we're thinking about this wrong. Have you come across anything like that?
I mean, I think that there are ultimately a lot of the leadership literature is, and this is the case with most research, it's very specific. So it's, what happens if you deploy this kind of leadership strategy, but is one way that some leadership work is done, but others it's like feedback, right? How do you give good feedback? What does that look like? How does that affect people? Those sorts of things, persuasion. And so it's very specific. So most of the time when I'm looking at the literature, it isn't necessarily surprising to me, but that may be because I've got a library of, a lot of books and scientific papers and all that are in my head, so that really when we're doing these episodes, when I'm recording the episodes, I'm trying to assume it's this balance between assuming or demonstrating naivete about the topic, right? So that my guest can talk and share their experience, but when necessary, bringing in augmenting what they have to say, right? So it's this dance, if you will. And so I think there are a lot of things in literature that people don't know, especially when it comes to things like cognitive biases. I would say that's probably the area that most people who are listening to this podcast or my podcast or any other don't understand, right? A lot's thrown around in pop culture about biases right now, and people think that it means, they lock in on we're talking about some I like women with blonde hair bias or whatever it may be, right?
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these cognitive pathways that make it easier so that we don't have to use all of our brain energy to make what are routine decisions in life, right? Like if a loud noise happens behind us at night, our response is run. It's not, let's turn around and investigate that, right? And so it's the same sort of mental construct with biases. And so an example of one that a lot of people don't understand, they don't even know it exists, is called the fundamental attribution error. This is one that I talk about on one of the podcast episodes, and then I talk about with my kids all the time. But it's how people assume the worst in somebody else,
Mhm.
not intentionally per se, but basically we have the data set from our own experience and perception that we have, right? So we know our perspective. I don't know your perspective, okay? And you don't know mine, really. We know our own. And we assess what other people do based on our perspective, not on theirs. So the example that I use a lot of times to help people understand this idea, I have a buddy and he is a cardiac anesthesiologist and he's intermittently a co-host on my podcast. And so in his world, things get serious very quickly and he has to be places in the hospital rapidly and that not so much me as I'm not on the same sort of space as he is with regard to that. Now, we're friends. Now, imagine that there's a kid who's dying, okay, in the ICU, and they have to put him on a life support machine called ECMO. He needs to be there as fast as he can go, right? Like as fast as humanly possible. And he's walking from one place in the hospital, and I'm walking from another, and we're going to pass each other in the hall. He's my friend. I'm expecting, hey, Justin, how are you? How are things going?
Mm.
And he is going to save a kid's life. He has no time for courtesy, and so he just blows right by me like I'm a piece of the wall, right? From my perspective, it's like, what a jerk. That guy's a total jerk. I thought we were buddies, right? From his perspective, if he even saw me, it's like there's a kid dying and all that dude wants to do is talk about whatever it is, the sun outside or whatever, right? And so So we do this a lot every day. Most people do this. And so this really has an impact on leadership because unless you know where the other person is and what their perspective is and so forth, unless you can stop yourself and go, how am I seeing this the wrong way? What's a different way to see this? Unless you can stop yourself, then you're going to run into all sorts of problems. And people do that all the time. So that's an example of some of the things that I think are surprising to folks who are not familiar with those sorts of neurophysiology and psychology sort of things.
That's a great example, Tom. I really appreciate you sharing that. And then it makes me wonder, how do we as leaders develop that awareness for different perspective and know, you know how to pause, maybe you start practicing, okay, I'm going to pause and take a step back. How do we get to the next step of examining the perspective or in your example, you don't have time to go to the person and ask them, "Hey, what's going on?" Right? They're in a rush, but in another situation or maybe as a follow-up, how do you reexamine that and get a little bit greater perspective or better understanding?
Yeah. So that's a if we step out of just talking about leadership, right? And just pretend like we're just a couple of humans talking. The the answer is very simple. Ask and then care about the answer, right? Like it's strong conviction loosely held, or it's listening with a willingness to be persuaded, as General Jim Mattis told me. A huge part of the problem is we don't ask. People in leadership positions, not to be confused with leaders, people in leadership positions often assume that they know everything. And when you do that, you're cutting yourself off from all this other perspective, all this other input that can actually help you to know so much more and to be so much more effective. But if you don't ask, if you don't take the time to stop and say, how could I be getting this wrong? How am I too narrowly focused? Then you're going to miss so much the majority of the time. There's a phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so this was a study that was done a couple decades ago. I replicated it in a set of physicians looking at leadership. And the findings were, I mean, eerily consistent. And so what you find is the people if you take percentiles, okay, if you have 100 people and you rank them all in order on a score, any given score, there'll be number 25, right? So that means that 24 people are not as good at whatever it is, but 75 people are better, right? And then you can go 50th percentile and 75th and 100, there's one person at the top. Well, if you take those people who are basically at the 25th percentile, if you said, how good are you at whatever it is? Those people will say that they're about the 66th percentile. Those people at the top end will also say they're about the 66th percentile. So the people that are the worst think they're as good as the people who are the best, but they're drastically different, right? And so the point there is the odds are you're not as good as you think you are. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a 25% chance that you may be as good as you think you are. When I asked the physicians in this study, compared to everybody else, all other, leaders and physicians, how, again, on average, how do you compare to everybody else? It was over the 70th percentile, right? Mathematically, it should be 50th because half of them should go, well, I'm probably not as good as everybody. No, everybody essentially thought that they're better than everybody else. Mathematically, that can't be true, right? Like half
Right.
of you have to be worse than the other half. Like that's just so.
Wow.
And you see that like it's not just doctors. Not we're not. People have shown this
Treatment
in
doctors. Yeah.
yeah, in a number of different areas, okay? But generally, we overestimate our capabilities.
Mm.
And so as leaders, we are the same. We overestimate our capabilities, and if you really wanna be the best, you gotta recognize that, and you gotta bolster it by seeing what everybody else thinks. Doesn't mean you gotta do what they recommend, but it's taking the opportunity to seek their perspective.
Is that the same effect that can happen to those that are in that higher or that higher knowledge bracket percentile where they adopt greater imposter syndrome because they know so much? I'm wondering, is there a connection between the Dunning-Kruger effect and imposter syndrome in that regard too? What do you think?
My tendency is to let me think about this for a second.
I might need to actually do the research on that, but
Yeah,
it makes me wonder, if there are folks that think very highly of themselves, but they tend to be in the lesser bracket than are there folks who are in
yeah, I
that
mean,
top.
I think effectively, we could say that imposter syndrome usually is people who are afraid they don't belong, even though all indicators are that they do.
Right. Yeah.
And so, kind of what we're talking about is the inverse of that, in
Mhm.
the sense that it's people that think they're really good and they're not, right?
Yeah.
So they think they're good and the data show that they're not, versus the imposter syndrome, they think they're not good, but the data show that they are,
Yeah.
right? So it's the inverse of the two. Yeah.
That would be well, it's so fascinating, and when you explain it, it makes a lot of reasonable, logical sense too. But then, I think, okay, so if we have this understanding and this research, and then to your point, what do we take away? What do we do with that, right? So it is situations where we as leaders not only have to have the different perspectives, but at the same time, we probably have to keep absorbing new information, not just other perspectives, right? Listening to your podcast, reading your book, listening to this podcast, and learning from all guests' insights. Is that going to help keep us sharp so that we can advance ourselves? Are there other ways that we can go about scaling our own growth and development, if you will, as leaders?
Yeah, so great question. And yes, if we're continually putting these things in the front of our mind and getting new ideas and different perspectives on leadership, for instance, then we're going to keep thinking about those things, and it's going to basically form cognitive neural pathways in our brain so that these things are linked and easier and to actualize in our own lives. So definitely lifelong learning is something that every leader should aspire to pursue, or should just pursue. I should get rid of the aspire to, should pursue. You owe it to the people that you're leading to always be improving, because the reality is what you are today is not good enough for tomorrow. If you sit on your laurels, your competition, whatever that competition may be, it may be, somebody in the business domain who is trying to get their product to market faster. While you're sitting on your rear end, they're working, they're getting better. They're going to beat you. If it's going to war, the same thing. If you sit on your laurels, your competition is going to beat you and you're going to lose. And so you always have to be seeking to improve. Be better tomorrow than you are today. Better today than you were yesterday. Continual improvement. So that's one thing I would say. Things that have been shown scientifically with regard to leadership development that work. There are four major components that any effective leadership development program, if you will, plan should have. The first is personal study. Okay, so I said I started reading all these books, right? The second is formal training. That doesn't mean you got to do a master's. I'm currently doing a PhD in leadership, but doesn't mean you got to do that. I'm insane. Not really, but you know,
Yeah.
I'm going overboard. But it can be some course, it can be different things, like a week here, 2 days there, whatever it may be, some online deal, formal training, a mentor, somebody who can help you go through these things, identify areas where you can improve, give you tips and ways to think about things in your particular context. And then the fourth thing is actually doing it, practical experience in leading other people. So those are the four things that have been shown really to be able to foster consistent leadership capabilities.
That's great, Tom. Is there any advice that you would give to someone who isn't yet responsible for people and they want to be that leader and they don't have the opportunity yet? How could they best reach that goal in addition to all the prep that you described? Is there something that they can do in their workplace to help advance themselves without having that full title and responsibility yet?
Yeah. So, Rebecca, great question. I'm going to take it a little bit of a different direction before we come back to what you're asking. The difference between being a leader and occupying a leadership position. And so when I talk about being a leader, it has nothing to do with rank or formal title or position or anything like that. Leadership, if you boil it down, I did a study on this and actually have defined it scientifically, but if you boil leadership down, it's very simple. Influencing other people to achieve mutually beneficial goals. That's all. And so right now, okay, I'm going to influence you and everybody in the audience. Think of a blue whale, okay? Probably people started thinking of a blue whale, or a pink elephant or whatever it is, right? Like I'm influencing you to think about this thing. And leadership is just that. You're just influencing somebody. So if you're, working at your desk in your cubicle or whatever it may be, you have the opportunity to influence other people if you embrace that opportunity and influence them in positive ways toward a common goal that's important for your organization, you will be seen for that. People will recognize that and you will have opportunities then come your way. And so right now, wherever you are, you have the opportunity to begin that fourth phase of practicing it where you are. So I would say shift the mindset toward I'm a leader now. I need to get my act together, right? How can I, in this moment, if I'm on my team, yeah, maybe I'm the lowest person on the hierarchical totem pole, but there are a lot of people in leadership positions, some the highest in the world, who don't know what they're doing. And people below them have the opportunity to change the outcome. And it's incumbent on those people, all of them, to do that, to lead, to influence, to make a positive difference in the organization.
Tom, such wise words and really great advice. Thank you so much for sharing just everything. I can't wait to dive into your podcast. I know I'm going to learn even more. I want more of the science now. You have me craving it. Such a great foundation for all of us, and I love the practical approach so that we can all take that action. So, all of that said, I want to make sure that people can take action and find you online wherever you would like to guide people. Where would you like people to go to get in touch, to listen to the podcast, make sure they hear about the book when it's out?
Yeah. Well, thanks for the opportunity. So you can find us on our YouTube channel. It's The Science of Leadership. And so you can just look for that. As far as we have shorts, we have mid length videos, we have full videos of all these great folks that we've interviewed and so forth. And then we have audio podcasts, and that's available on pretty much all the big platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So and that's The Science of Leadership. So that can be found there. We have a website, fourstarleaders.com, and you can, get in touch with us there as well. And then the book is set to come out the 21st of July. It's called The Four Stars of Leadership.
We're going to mark that for our calendars and make sure we get a copy. Tom, thank you so much. This has definitely been my honor, and it's always a pleasure hosting our audience for another episode of Bad Bosses, Great Leaders podcast. Thank you all for joining me.